Support Lightning Debate on Patreon.
Hi guys, Jeff here. So the season is rapidly approaching, and I see that a lot of novices are starting to get nervous, starting to get anxious for their first tournaments, and they're worried about what they're going to face in round. So I helped you out with that first video on the channel, the top 5 mistakes debaters make in round. So I'm going to be helping out again today, and this time I'm going to be helping out with more specific LD advice. With LD is a wonderful event, but the one thing that throws a lot of people off at the beginning is how much philosophy you need to know when you're debating, especially when you get started in the mid novice level to lower varsity level, how familiar you have to be with certain philosophies. So I'm going to help you guys out by giving you a head start by helping you guys know what are the top 5 philosophies you need to know before you start your next round. All right, so let's just get right into it. Okay, number 5. Number 5 are what I like to call the Maxim philosophies. So how you identify a Maxim philosophy is usually by its name. So they usually have names something along the lines of the maximization of this principle, or the rejection of this principle. Or other things that fit into this group are the philosophies such as self-determination or anti-paternalism or liberty. Those are very key players in the Maxim principles. So the reason why we group these all together, because they usually are almost like second values, but they usually have more meat on them, so that makes them closer to the line of a philosophy and a criterion. So let's just break them down on how you address them in round. So let's talk about maximization. So the maximization of a principle, you really want to go at in cross-examination, why is this particular principle the most important thing to maximize in the round, and should it be the sole thing that should be maximized or just the most important thing to be maximized? For example, if you use a criterion, let's say the maximization is the maximization of wealth. Okay, why do we need to maximize wealth? All right, so does wealth equate to quality of life or happiness? Okay, well, if that's the case, then you can easily argue against that. Wealth does not equate quality of life or happiness. It might increase living standards, however, that does not necessarily increase happiness. Do we need to increase the wealth for all people, or do we need to increase wealth people who don't have it? Because it's been shown that adding wealth to people who don't have, who already have enormous amounts of wealth, have no positive effect on them. And also we need to say, are we just going to be giving out money in this plan to maximize wealth? Because other than that, you'd actually be making people poor by devaluing their currency, which would actually make them less wealthy. So these are the questions you want to ask in cross-examination. So let's look at another philosophy that's the inverse, the rejection philosophies. The most popular rejection philosophy happens to be the rejection of violence. So how you tackle this are more hypotheticals in which that action would be morally justified. The most popular defense against rejection of violence happens to be self-defense. Okay, let's say someone is assaulting me. What do I do? Do I condemn them for assaulting me? Well, if that happens, the violence continues. So therefore, I don't reject the violence because I don't do anything to stop it. If I thus protect myself, then I am using violence against that person, and thus I'm actually still condoning violence. Therefore, there is no situation where the violence can be rejected in an issue of someone actually assaulting another person. And that creates a moral quandary for the only way to actually create a system where you reject violence is allowing for some level of violence in some situations, which again defeats the entire point of rejecting violence. So therefore, you see that creates a moral quandary and doesn't really give your opponent any moral leeway or standing in this debate. So I'm just going to run through anti-paternalism really quickly. It's usually basically a freedom sort of ideology, so saying freedom's not always good. People shouldn't always be able to do what they want. People shouldn't be able to harm people freely, and even if you say, okay, my philosophy does not say that you can just harm people just as the government shouldn't interfere with personal things, you just say, well, to those people who are harming people for fun, that is their personal business, and those people who feel the government should not impede them. So therefore, what makes you say this person does not have the right to harm someone if A, they consider that a personal right to do as they please, and B, they agree that the government should not be able to tell them what to do or have any moral influence over them. And that creates, basically shuts down that ideology right there. Okay, so number 4 happens to be the social contract. If you've taken a history or social studies class, you are somewhat familiar of how the social contract works, so you understand a little bit about it. And you probably know or remember one or two authors like John Locke, which happens to be the more famous American author, well, not American, but American influences on the American social contract and American governmental system. So you're going to see that you're familiar with his works. But there are other people that you want to know, and most notably happens to be the French philosopher Rousseau, who happens to be very prominent in his social contract theory. So you want to be familiar with his theory on the social contract. But for those who don't know what the social contract is, basically what the social contract is saying that the people give the government the power to govern, as in we allow the government to govern it ourselves, as in we give up our natural born rights, our right to do whatever we want, our freedom to do whatever we want, in order for the government to protect us and give us added protections that we can't receive. For example, you give up your right to go beat up anyone you want in order to receive the protection where that the government will provide assistance to you if you are in danger, or protect against foreign invaders if they were to invade the country or invade the homeland. So it's a mutual exchange of rights for protections, and this give and take happens basically for as long as the government exists. So how you attack the social contract is you either go in two ways. You either A, say that the social contract does not exist and that people are not, the social contract can only be signed or agreed to by those who are there at the beginning of a government. For example, the founding fathers and those people who happen to vote on the Constitution at that time. Those people are really the ones who are part of the social contract. But anyone who is born as a citizen of the United States afterwards didn't really have a choice to abide by the social contract. So they did not really, were not really party to the contract. They were just made as a part of the contract at birth, and that's unfair. So that's another quandary for the social contract, that most people at this point in time are forced into their social contracts based off where they are born, and thus they have allegiances to countries at birth when you are a baby and you're really unable of making decisions for yourself. So then then the government is now saying, okay, we've taken away your rights that you have just been born with. We've already taken them away before you've even had the chance to decide whether or not we want to be taken away or not. Right? And the second way you can attack the social contract is by saying that the social contract has no basis with morality. So a lot of times people make the basis that morality comes from the social contract. However, you can basically say that if it's that morality comes from the social contract, then why are there immoral or unjust governments? Or is it possible for governments to condone immoral behavior? For example, if you look at slavery, that at the time was considered by law part of the social contract. However, in most countries today, we recognize that as immoral. So even though we recognize it immoral now, it was still immoral back then. The morality did not change. All that changed was the government standing on the issue, which creates a quandary where if the government can be morally wrong, therefore morality cannot come from a governmental structure. So the third one you want to know happens to be consequentialism. Now, consequentialism happens to be a very large school of thought. So basically what it means is that you are deciding whether an action is immoral by looking at what that action causes, by looking at the consequences of actions in order to determine whether or not the action is moral or immoral. For example, some forms of consequentialism actually look at the joint impact of the consequence and the intended consequence in order to determine morality. Some forms of consequentialism only take into effect the consequence rather than the intent and the consequences combined. It's usually fairly ambiguous. There's not like a direct trick for whether what is considered a good or bad consequence and how much of a good consequence would be needed in order to consider an action moral or not. These are more delved into in individual schools of thoughts of consequentialism, and we're going to go into one of those a little later into the video. Okay, so number 2, this is the second most prominent philosophy you see at the novice level and at the local varsity level, and that happens to be the philosophy of 1,000 names. So I'm just going to run by most of the most common names this philosophy is called by: Kantianism, the Kantian ethics, the categorical imperative, deontology. All of those are basically the same philosophy, even though when you look at the ones that use the word Kant, they're referring to the philosophy's chief writer, which happens to be Immanuel Kant. So what deontology means, that's basically saying we're looking at the intentions of an action to determine whether or not that action was immoral. So, for example, in every situation, you need to identify whether or not you could do this you can follow 2 rules. A, you can do what you are about to do in any situation at any time. And 2, you can make it so that anyone else could also do it and would also be fine. So let's use an example. If I were to go to a banana shop and I'm hungry and I have no money and I see that the cashier is distracted and I want to go and I want to take one of the bananas, now let's look at the morality of that situation. Okay, the action I want to take in is called stealing. So what would stealing entail? If I were to steal, that means that anyone else could steal. Thus, if anyone else can steal, if I steal a banana, someone else could just steal the banana from me. Thus, it doesn't make it a moral action because I don't benefit, and it's not moral for me to just take a banana and say, well, since I took the banana, no one else can take the banana from me. So that makes it fail morally. So the way that Kantianism is generally attacked is used by the example of the Axeman. So what the Axeman example hypothetical puts in is that, say you were in a home and you are there with your friend. Then someone knocks at the door and you answer the door and you see a man with an axe saying they've come to kill their friend and they want to know where he is. So you have 2 options. One of them is to tell him the truth. However, this causes your friend to be killed, and thus you yourself are the cause of your friend's death by telling them where they are. This is assisted murder. You are an accomplice to your friend's murder by allowing the person who have told you their intent to murder them how and where they can murder them. The other action is to lie, to tell them that your friend is not here and you have not seen him. Now, lying under the categorical imperative is also wrong, because if you lie, you can also expect everyone to lie to you, and thus no one will ever tell the truth, thus making that an immoral action at that time. So if you look at the 2 options, both of them under the categorical imperative would be wrong. However, under most other frameworks, lying would be justified here because the impact of lying is much less than the impact of assisted murder. Alright, so now we're going to go into number 1. And it's number 1 not because it's my favorite or anyone else's favorite, it's because it's the most popular philosophy talked about and used in rounds. And that happens to be the philosophy of utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist philosophy, like I talked about in number 3, but it has more refinements in it. So there are different aspects of and different types of utilitarianism. So let's go into the most basic level. The utilitarianism is defined as the maximization of happiness for the most people at a time. So what you want to say, look into when you look into utilitarianism, is that you want to make sure that when you look at what you're about to do, you want to say how much happiness or pleasure is this action going to cause, as opposed to how much pain this action is going to cause. So let's look at an example, right? Let's say you have to decide on a policy in order to give aid relief to the poor. What it's going to do is going to raise taxes on the wealthier citizens in the city, and use those taxes to redistribute that wealth to the poor citizens of the city. So let's use the utilitarian calculus right there. The pain that the wealthy are going to feel from losing money is going to be marginal at best, since most of them will be able to live sustainable lives and their quality of life will not severely diminish based off them losing a portion of their wealth. However, the joy and pleasure that is gained by the poor receiving more wealth is going to be significantly higher than the pain caused by the wealthy losing that top-end wealth. So you're going to see that under utilitarian calculus, the proper thing would be to cause the redistribution of wealth, because then more people who are poor are going to have an improved quality of life, are going to have more money in their pocket, more abilities to eat. They're going to have much better lives by receiving that money than the poor, who are more than likely going to put that money into 401ks, already have so much money they barely know how to spend it, and all those other things. Not to say that I agree with the utilitarian calculus, but that's what utilitarian calculus would say. Now, how do you attack utilitarian calculus? So the problem with utilitarian calculus, it's so focused on the ends that sometimes it can justify outrageous actions. For example, how much ice cream would you have to give to someone in order to justify killing someone else? So think about that. Based off the idea that all you have to do is outweigh pleasure with pain, you can just say, okay, if I give ice cream to X amount of people, let's say it's 10,000 people, thus I would then say, okay, now since I've gave 10,000 people ice cream, it's okay to kill this one person. Again, that makes no sense, but under utilitarian calculus, it still matches up. The math still adds up eventually if you give enough people ice cream, and the situation hinges on it, where if you allow me to kill this person, I'll give everyone free ice cream. I mean, eventually there becomes a point numerically under utilitarian calculus where that becomes acceptable. All right, guys, so that wraps up the video. Like and subscribe. Hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope you have great rounds this season. Jeff out.
Support Lightning Debate on Patreon.